Welcome back to The World Today. Residents in Beijing have expressed discontent today over the country's strict COVID-19 policies as cases in the Chinese capital hit fresh highs each day, prompting the city's government to urge more residents to stay at home. More cities resumed mass testing for COVID-19 as China fights a spike in new cases. Nationally, 28,127 new local cases were reported for Monday, nearing China's daily peak from April. Beijing shut parks, shopping malls and museums after warning a day earlier that the capital was facing its most severe test of COVID-19 pandemic, shutting businesses and schools in hard-hit districts and tightening rules for entering the city as infections ticked higher there as well as nationally. Dr. Abdulaziz Bako is a health scientist and he joins me now on how effective the policy China is. Thanks, Dr. Bako, for joining me on the program. So maybe for a lot of people, a lot of places that have opened up and are somewhat back to normal, they're wondering what China is doing. First, do you think that the country is experiencing a new wave and one that is more severe?
Thank you for having me. Indeed, China is still having a really dangerously low vaccination rate especially among the older adult population. It's also having a really stressed up healthcare system, and also the fact that the pandemic is still going on. I think given these circumstances, China still has to continue maintaining these kinds of policies and procedures to protect itself from a dangerous scenario whereby the COVID cases explode and their health systems become unable to cater for patients.
But how would you perhaps describe the measures it is taking to curb the spread? Many of them are complaining economically. A lot of families, people are going bankrupt, companies, and the hardships that they are facing as a result of this COVID policy.
A lot of people, particularly when it comes to measures for COVID-19, it's kind of a scenario whereby countries have to choose between the devil and the deep blue sea, because COVID-19 is a dangerous disease that can wipe out a very large section of the population, particularly the vulnerable ones, which I mentioned have a really dangerously low vaccination rate. So it's a really a difficult choice to make. The economy certainly would be affected, but the country needs to do a lot to create safety nets to make sure that they are protecting their economy as well. But these measures are really necessary to prevent catastrophe.
And China, you mentioned that it hasn't vaccinated a lot of its older population, but then it has also vaccinated a good number. And some would also argue using largely its own vaccines, shots of China's CoronaVac and Sinopharm, which, it has also donated globally. But local, perhaps studies, some have said, question the length of the vaccines in terms of the protection that they offer. Do you think that this could be a challenge? And how do you think that they can surmount this? Is more vaccination the answer, more regular vaccination as well?
It's still a topic of study, a topic of investigation. I think the length of time in which immunity is given by the COVID-19 vaccines that are available is something that is not 100% understood. But I think this is something that the scientists need to really focus on and kind of try to have an optimal level of vaccination that would protect a really large section of the population, and also work hard to convince people to regularly take the vaccines if needed. So I think it's a really hard question to answer. It's also a hard thing to sell, even when we know exactly the amount of time people need to get those vaccines.
And the WHO is also recommending perhaps a different way, method of trying to stop the spread of the cases. The WHO has talked about the current Omicron variant spreading across China, saying that it is more infectious than other variants, saying that the virus is evolving and changing behavior. But then let's move away from talking about that to what we're hearing about a sort of triple-demic in the United States and Canada. And this is with, the rise in RSV, or what is called respiratory syncytial virus. How different is this from COVID-19?
So the respiratory syncytial virus is a virus that has been there for quite a long time. It affects, in general, it is a virus that causes respiratory or affects the respiratory system. Usually in infants, it's kind of mostly associated with bronchiolitis. In adults, it can cause the common cold, and also especially in people who are immunocompromised, they can have it can lead to severe pneumonia and even death. It it is associated with death of up to about 60,000 children every year, and it affects a very large chunk of the entire world's population. So it's a disease it has been there, and it has been causing damage for quite a while. But unfortunately, in the setting of COVID and also flu, we are seeing what you have rightly called triple demic, whereby the healthcare systems are getting filled up to capacity, and in some cases even beyond the capacity, and that is seriously and adversely affecting the nation's ability to handle healthcare.
As a health scientist, what's your take as to future preparations against pandemic, epidemic, triple-demic of this nature? And seeing as we have experienced, the pandemic of COVID-19, and, who knows what is to come?
The biggest challenge has been infodemic. That's the spread of misinformation around the globe about vaccines and so on. That has adversely affect not only the COVID vaccine, but also other vaccines, for example, flu vaccine and other vaccinations. So the important thing that the world really has to focus on is, one, fighting the infodemic, and trying to sell out the correct information to people, and also improving people's you know um, acceptance, and also reducing hesitancy to accept the vaccine among populations. Also, these emerging infections, there needs to be a lot of effort looking forward, efforts to develop not only vaccines but also treatment, confirmatory treatment strategies, and also continuous public health awareness among individuals.
Dr. Abdulaziz Bako, health scientist, joining us from the United States. Many thanks.
Oh,
We go to other stories where 8 people have died after a small plane crashed into a residential area of Colombia's second largest city of Medellin on Monday. Footage showed firefighters at Berlin Rosales neighborhood on top of roofs trying to put out the fire. Medellin's mayor, Daniel Quintero, said 8 people were on board and that authorities had identified all their bodies at the scene of the accident. Mayor Quintero also said the plane broke into 3 parts and at least 6 buildings were hit and 7 homes were totally destroyed. Colombia's Civil Aeronautics said the PA-31 type plane covered the route between Medellin and the municipality of Pizarro in the Jungle Department of Choco. Still in the region, a massive fire engulfed at least 40 hectares in Chile's Valparaiso area, this according to the National Disaster Prevention and Response System. Footage showed firefighters' emergency vehicles at the scene battling the fire and a volunteer who tried to put out the blaze with a water bucket. Leonardo Araya, commander of the local firefighters team, said the fire was hard to battle due to strong winds and high temperatures. Kuopio's mayor confirmed there were 3 simultaneous fire outbreaks that have not been controlled. Houses in the area are at risk, but none has been affected yet. And over to South Sudan, where the United Nations mission there is supporting initiatives to prepare and educate women parliamentarians on their new roles in the country's future. The Women Caucus is a non-partisan organization that aims to bring together all women parliamentarians to work for the development and promotion of all women within South Sudan.
Ever since the major inclusion of women in the revitalized peace agreement, the United Nations mission in South Sudan has moved to support more initiatives like the Women's Caucus. This caucus is meant to strengthen women leaders with further knowledge and skills to effectively undertake the legislative, representative, and oversight function, particularly in women's rights and gender equality. The 3-day launch brings together women from a cross-section of society in central equatorial state who are then given the presentation of the mandate of the mission, are to be introduced to the Constitution of South Sudan and informed of its roles while also being trained in leadership skills and the work of the caucus.
UNMISS Juba Field Office remains very much committed and will, through its various substantive sections in this new phase of the Parliament, engage with the Women Caucus through capacity building, capacity strengthening, supporting the development of your strategic plans, and continuing to work with male champions as well within the Parliament to support the promotion of discussions and initiatives on gender equality and the empowerment of women within the Parliament and beyond.
Gender equality has been one of the main issues women of the caucus have been championing. They feel that women are keeping the peace in South Sudan.
It's important for us to have this caucus because of for us as women, we have women in the grassroots and we have women's activists that we need to sit down and embrace the peace together and move forward together as women of Central Equatoria State. So it is important for us to have women caucus, which is bringing women together at the grassroots level. And also we listen to their views so that we can be able also to represent their problems at our assembly.
Our aim is to back up or to support issues that are related to gender-based violence. For instance, last time there is an incident that has happened in Wau, in northern Barghazal of Wau, which was the defilment or the raping of the late child. So at that particular time, the Women Parliamentary Caucus came out and condemned that. So we are there to back up or to support issues, okay? In case if something bad if there is something bad that has happened to a woman or a child, okay, we condemn that.
At the end of the 3-day workshop, the Women Caucus hopes to have an agreed-upon constitution to guide them moving forward so they'll have a strong voice as the country nears elections.
Well, let's now take you to one of our top stories, the tragedy in Indonesia as death toll is climbing to over 260. The destruction, devastation from the earthquake remains very evident. Jessica Stone is VOA's from VOA's English to Asia team, and she joins me now from Washington. Thanks, Jessica, for joining me. A very tragic incident in Java. What more are we learning?
Well, as you mentioned, the latest death figures we have at this point are 268 people dead, at least 1,000 injured, and more than 151 missing, many of them children. This was a 5.6 magnitude earthquake, and it took place just about 4 hours drive south and east of Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. Rescuers now combing through the rubble, in some cases with their very hands, still looking for survivors. Millicent?
Where did the greatest damage occur? I mean, because we're hearing that, you know, many of them, children were involved, and then some who were in their homes, their apartments. Where did the greatest damage occur?
Well, by early accounts at this point, there was a lot of rural area impacted. So you're talking about not a heavily urban area, but a heavily populated area, because this is a very heavily populated part of the world. 2.5 million people, in fact, just live in the area that we're talking about being hit. And VOA has a reporter on the ground, and what he is telling us is that he can't find electricity or internet access to even file his reports just yet. He has been in rural areas where understandably many children have been buried by these earthquakes because they were in school or they were in after school programming for Islamic studies. And they were inside buildings that then collapsed on them. Some of them, many of them still trapped under that debris. In other words, they weren't out playing or doing homework. They weren't able to get out of the location quickly enough because there was no warning, Melissa.
We understand that about 1,000 are injured from this earthquake, but what would you say is the most urgent need for survivors of this quake?
Well, they need basic supplies like food, water, and electricity, clean drinking water in particular. And many of these remote areas were impacted by the damage. In other words, the routes of transportation impacted. So roads, bridges. In one village, Sijidul, also a landslide there, burying roads and homes. And their hospitals are also very overwhelmed. They also need land moving equipment because there's a lot of rubble to search through.
Do we know how much humanitarian and government response are going in, you know, to sort of coordinating their response to the disaster?
Well, I've looked into this, and at this point, what we know is this: the International Red Cross, as well as the Red Crescent, are on the scene, and they're making a determination what needs to happen in the short term and the long term. What they're saying right now is a short-term need is that access to drinking water, access to telecommunications, and access to electricity. We also know that President Joko Widodo visited the epicenter on Tuesday, which is Cianjur. He promised the equivalent of about $3,000 per family for each house that was damaged. But these recoveries tend to be very long, and all of our reporting team and the Indonesian service at VOA says that the infrastructure in particular is a critical need in this part of the world. It just, in this particular part of Indonesia, is not up to snuff for protecting the lives that it's housing.
And I was going to ask as well, do we know if there were any warnings before it occurred? We understand that the country has a history of devastating tremors and also tsunamis. Is it possible for them to prevent something like this happening again?
You know, what's unfortunate is that this is a way of life for Indonesians, but because this earthquake was so shallow, and it was near the fault lines that were heavily populated. That is why the damage was so extensive. This is really a medium-sized earthquake in terms of being 5.6 on the Richter scale. But because there cannot be such a thing as an earthquake warning, only a tsunami warning. In other words, that means you've tracked the earthquake and you can see or anticipate that the tsunami will be coming. There was no warning, but it was particularly severe because of the shallow nature of the quake and the high population density and the low ability to build homes there and buildings that could survive what we would call a modern day earthquake testing. Melissa?
Jessica, thanks a lot for that update.
You bet.
UAE's Jessica Stone live for us there in Washington. Meanwhile, Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said there were no known injuries. This is after 2 earthquakes hit the Solomon Islands this afternoon, including one with a magnitude of 7.0 just off the southwest coast. The first quake hit at a depth of 15 kilometers, about 16 kilometers southwest of the area of Malango, said the United States Geological Survey, which had initially put its magnitude at 7.3. A second quake with a magnitude of 6.0 struck nearby just 30 minutes later.
But the roof of the High Commission Annex has collapsed. In Honiara this morning, there was a 7.3 magnitude earthquake at 10 kilometre depth. There are reports of aftershocks. All staff of the Australian High Commission are safe. There are no known injuries, but the roof of the High Commission Annex has collapsed, which would point to likely damage throughout the city. Staff have been moved to higher ground because there was a tsunami warning that was issued. Our High Commission is seeking to confirm the safety of all Australians in the Solomons. There are difficulties because phone lines have gone down, so there are communication difficulties there. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has stood up a consular emergency task force to lead consular response and support. Solomon Islands Police are out doing damage assessment. We have contacted Prime Minister Sogavare to once again indicate that Australia stands ready to assist. We have, of course, historically played an important role in the Solomon Islands.
Welcome back. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken says his country's relationship with Saudi Arabia was still under review, despite the administration's ruling that the Saudi Crown Prince has immunity from a lawsuit over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Mr. Blinken is in Qatar for the yearly U.S.-Qatar Strategic Dialogue and said the ruling did not impact the relationship with Riyadh and said there were no plans for Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman to visit the United States.
As to Iran, I can't confirm any reports about their activities. It's something that we're looking at very carefully and very closely. And what we've seen, and we've spoken of many, many times before, is that while we continue to believe that the best way to resolve the challenges posed by Iran's nuclear program are through diplomacy, Iran, for a variety of reasons, has chosen to insert extraneous issues into the effort to revive the JCPOA. It's always concerning, from my perspective, when we see any restrictions on freedom of expression. It's especially so when the expression is for diversity and for inclusion. And in my judgment, at least, no one on a football pitch should be forced to choose between supporting these values and playing for their team.
It's vital for the U.S. to have a partner like Qatar in this region. It's vital for us globally to have a partner like the U.S. And I've been saying this repeatedly. Qatar-U.S. partnership is actually the most important international relationship that Qatar has on the international scene beyond our region. So this is something that we are committed to pursue together with my colleague Tony, to continue pursuing this with also the future administration, whoever will come after me or after him. Thank you.
Talking about bilateral visits, King Charles hosted his first state visit since becoming British monarch today, welcoming South African President Cyril Ramaphosa to Buckingham Palace. The monarch, 74, rode out the traditional ceremony for the first time as head of state as Britain seeks to bolster its relations with its biggest trading partner in Africa. There were gun salutes, a ceremonial welcome from the king and his wife Camilla, the Queen Consort, before a grand carriage procession along the Mall to Buckingham Palace. Mr. Ramaphosa is scheduled to visit Westminster Abbey to lay a wreath at the tomb of the unknown warrior and see the memorial stone for former South African President Nelson Mandela. He will also address lawmakers in Parliament and meet Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Britain hopes the visit, which had been planned before the death of Queen Elizabeth in September, will strengthen trade and investment ties between the two nations and show the importance of links with the Commonwealth of Nations, the international organisation which King Charles now heads. The last state visit to Britain by a South African leader was that of President Jacob Zuma in 2010, when he was met by Charles and Camilla at the start of the trip. And UK Foreign Minister Cleverly, who you just saw there, sees an opportunity in building on close working relationship with South Africa. Here's what he had to say.
Today I had a breakfast meeting with Foreign Minister Dr. Pandor of South Africa, and we are welcoming today the President of South Africa on a state visit. And this is a reinforcement of the strong bilateral relationship that we have with South Africa, a real opportunity to build on that close working relationship and discuss some of the issues that affect us all, climate change, food security, energy security, and the partnership working that we have already got in place that we're going to build on to help develop the economies both here and in South Africa, and get more people to people, get more education together as well. Well, the fact that we are welcoming the President of South Africa for His Majesty the King's first ever state visit, I think should be read as our enduring commitment to the continent. It's important that whilst we do focus on the Indo-Pacific as we set out in our integrated review, that we also show that that is not going to be at the expense of the incredibly important partnerships that we have through the Commonwealth and through other multilateral fora, and as well as the bilateral relationship. So we are absolutely committed to our strong friendship and partnership working with African countries, as well as, not instead of, the work that we're doing in the Indo-Pacific. Right, cheers lot guys, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, staying in the UK, British main opposition Labour leader Keir Starmer has warned business bosses that the days of low pay and cheap labour must end, putting him in line with Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who has also rejected calls for looser immigration rules. Some businesses have been pushing the government to ease immigration rules, especially from the European Union, to fill job vacancies and boost flagging growth, which they say has been worsened by the post-Brexit end of free movement from the bloc. Britain's exit from the EU was sold by its backers, including former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, as a way to take back control of immigration rates, which some voters said was squeezing access to both jobs and welfare benefits. Now, in a speech to the Confederation of British Industry CBI conference, Mr. Starmer doubled down on that message by telling businesses that a Labour government would work with companies to help the British economy off its immigration dependency. Let's move to the Middle East, where the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has said that the situation in Iran was critical, describing a hardening of the authorities' response to protests that have resulted in more than 300 deaths in the past 2 months. The Islamic Republic has been gripped by nationwide protests since the death of 22-year-old Kurdish woman Mahsa Amini in morality police custody on September 16 after she was arrested for wearing clothes deemed inappropriate. Iran has blamed foreign enemies and their agents for orchestrating the protests, which have turned into a popular revolt by Iranians from all layers of society posing one of the boldest challenges to the clerical rulers since the 1979 revolution. The moment U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris visited the Philippine island of Palawan in the South China Sea, part of a three-day trip to an Asian ally that is central to America's bid to counter China's increasingly assertive stance in the region. Beijing claims almost all the South China Sea, which is believed to contain massive oil and gas deposits and through which billions of dollars in trade passes each year. Mrs. Harris pledged the United States would defend the Philippines if it came under attack in the waterway, reaffirming Washington's commitment to its former colony. Finally on the program, China will send its third generation of astronauts for space missions in 2023. Yang Liwei, the deputy chief designer of China's manned space program, says the country has begun the selection of the fourth group, which will have 12 to 14 new spacemen. The third generation of Chinese astronauts consists of 18 astronauts in total, 17 male and 1 female. Among them, 7 will be working as spacecraft pilots, 7 as space flight engineers, and 4 as payload specialists. According to China's space program plan, there will be at least 2-3 astronaut crews carrying out Chinese space missions each year. The recruitment of the fourth generation new astronauts is expected to be completed in 18 months. And that's how we wrap things up here on The World Today. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Walker.